Before we begin tonight's terrifying true story, I want you to think about the last time you stopped at a roadside diner during a long drive. Maybe you were tired, hungry, just needed a break from hours behind the wheel. These places feel safe because they're public, familiar, part of the American road trip experience. But what happens when you stop at the wrong place and everyone inside has been waiting for someone exactly like you? Tonight's story comes from a man whose routine rest stop at a Texas diner turned into a coordinated trap that nearly cost him his life. As I tell you this story, remember that this really happened to a real person, and it's a reminder that predators sometimes work in groups, using familiar American institutions to identify and capture vulnerable travelers. My name is Kevin, and 3 years ago, I was making a cross-country drive from California to Florida for a job relocation. I decided to drive rather than fly because I had a lot of personal belongings and wanted the flexibility to take my time. The route took me through the southern states, and by the time I hit rural Texas, I'd been on the road for about 12 hours straight, pushing through the night to make better time while traffic was light. It was around 3:30 a.m. when I started feeling the kind of exhaustion that makes driving dangerous. My eyes were getting heavy. I'd been yawning constantly for the past hour, and I knew I needed to stop for coffee and maybe some food before I risked falling asleep at the wheel. The problem was that I was in the middle of absolutely nowhere, driving through empty Texas back roads with nothing but darkness and the occasional cattle fence visible in my headlights. When I finally saw the neon sign for Rusty's Diner, open 24 hours glowing in the distance, it felt like finding an oasis in the desert. The building was one of those classic American roadside diners, probably built in the 1960s, with that distinctive silver exterior and large windows that let you see the interior from the parking lot. There were about 6 or 7 cars parked in the lot, which surprised me given how isolated the location was and how late it was, but I figured maybe there was a nearby town I hadn't noticed, or perhaps truck drivers used this as a regular stop. I pulled into the parking lot and took a moment to stretch before heading inside. The cars around me were a mix of older model sedans and trucks, all covered with a thin layer of dust that suggested they'd been sitting there for a while. That detail registered in my mind as slightly odd, but I was too tired to really think about it. I just wanted coffee and maybe some eggs before getting back on the road. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and that's when I experienced the first real moment of unease. The diner appeared to be completely empty of customers, despite the parking lot full of vehicles. There were 3 staff members visible, a waitress in her 50s wearing a pink uniform, a cook visible through the kitchen window, and another man in a button-down shirt who might have been the manager or owner. All 3 of them stopped what they were doing and turned to look at me the instant I walked in, with expressions that weren't quite welcoming or friendly, more like they'd been waiting for me specifically. "Well, hello there, honey," the waitress said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You're out late tonight. Or early, I guess. Come on in. Sit anywhere you'd like." I chose a booth near the window so I could keep an eye on my car, which was packed with everything I owned. The waitress, whose name tag read Darlene, approached with a coffee pot almost immediately, pouring me a cup before I'd even fully settled into the booth. "You look tired, sweetie," she said, lingering by the table longer than seemed necessary. "Long drive?" I explained I was heading to Florida and had been driving most of the night. She nodded sympathetically, but there was something about her attention that felt performative rather than genuine, like she was gathering information more than making small talk. "Well, you're in luck," Darlene continued. "We've got a special going tonight. House specialty, best meal you'll find in 100 miles. You really should try it." I glanced at the menu and said I was just looking for coffee and maybe some scrambled eggs. Nothing fancy. But Darlene became oddly insistent about the house special, describing it in ways that didn't really make sense and pushing me to order it even after I'd clearly declined. "I really think you should have the special," she said, her tone shifting from friendly to something more pressuring. "Everyone who stops here ends up loving it. It's what makes this place memorable." The way she emphasized memorable sent a chill down my spine. I politely but firmly said I just wanted eggs and toast, and after a long moment of staring at me with that fixed smile, Darlene finally walked away to place my order. That's when I started really paying attention to my surroundings and noticing the details that were wrong. The diner was clearly set up to handle multiple customers, with about a dozen booths and several counter seats, but it was completely empty except for me. The kitchen looked recently used with plates stacked, and the grill showing signs of recent cooking, suggesting they'd had customers earlier. But where were all the people who'd driven those 6 or 7 cars in the parking lot? I watched Darlene go into the kitchen and saw her having a conversation with the cook and the other man, all 3 of them glancing in my direction while speaking in low voices. Their body language suggested they were coordinating something, making plans, and the way they kept looking at me made it clear I was the subject of their discussion. My exhaustion was suddenly overwhelmed by adrenaline and a growing sense that something was very wrong with this situation. I pulled out my phone to check if I had signal, thinking I might call someone or at least have the phone ready if I needed to call 911. I had 1 bar of service, enough to maybe get a call through, but not reliable enough to feel safe. When Darlene brought my food about 10 minutes later, she again insisted that I should have ordered the special and seemed genuinely disappointed that I'd stuck with my simple order. She placed the plate down and then, instead of leaving, she stood next to the booth watching me, as if waiting to see me start eating. "Go ahead, honey, eat up while it's hot," she said, still standing there. "You need your energy for the rest of your drive." The situation had crossed from merely uncomfortable into genuinely threatening. I had no appetite anymore, but I took a few bites of the eggs just to satisfy her so she'd leave me alone. She finally walked away, but I noticed she positioned herself at the counter where she could watch me while pretending to do other tasks. I decided I needed to use the bathroom before getting back on the road, partly because I actually needed to, and partly to splash some water on my face and think clearly about whether I was being paranoid or picking up on real danger signals. The bathroom was at the back of the diner, down a short hallway past the kitchen. As I walked down the hallway, I could hear Darlene, the cook, and the other man talking in the kitchen, their voices low but carrying in the quiet diner. What I heard made my blood run cold. "Think he'll go for the special next time," the cook was saying. "Doesn't matter now," the other man replied. "We can still use him. Darlene, go check if his keys are in his pocket or if he left them on the table." "Getting the back room ready?" Darlene asked. "Yeah, bring him through once he's done in the bathroom," the man said. "Add him to the collection. His car's perfect too, loaded with stuff." The casual way they discussed whatever they were planning made it clear this was routine. For them, something they'd done before with other travelers who'd stopped at the wrong place at the wrong time. The mention of a collection and back room suggested I wasn't the first person to be targeted here. I stood frozen in the bathroom hallway, trying to process what I'd just heard and figure out my options. I couldn't go back through the dining room without them knowing I'd overheard their conversation. The bathroom had a small window, but it was too high and too small to climb through. My car keys were... I suddenly realized I didn't remember seeing them on the table when Darlene brought my food. I checked my pockets with shaking hands. Empty. My keys were gone. I'd left them on the table when I went to the bathroom, and Darlene must have taken them while I was in the hallway. I was trapped in a rural Texas diner at 4 a.m. with no way to leave, and 3 people who'd been discussing adding me to some kind of collection. My phone showed that single bar of service, and I quickly dialed 911 while still in the hallway, speaking in a barely audible whisper to the dispatcher. I explained where I was, or at least approximately where I was, since I didn't know the exact address, and that I was being held against my will by the diner staff who'd stolen my car keys. The dispatcher kept me on the line but explained that the nearest sheriff's deputy was probably 20 minutes away, given how remote the location was. 20 minutes felt like an eternity when I could hear the staff in the kitchen discussing how to get me into the back room without causing a scene. I knew I couldn't stay hidden in the bathroom hallway forever, and I needed to either find my keys or find another way out of the building before they came looking for me. I noticed a door marked "Private Employees Only" at the end of the hallway. It was unlocked, and when I opened it quietly, I found myself in a storage area with industrial shelving containing restaurant supplies. But what caught my attention was another door at the back of the storage room, an exterior door that might lead outside to a loading area or back alley. The door was locked from the inside with a deadbolt, but I was able to turn it quietly. The door opened onto a loading dock area behind the diner, giving me access to the parking lot from a different angle than the main entrance. I could see my car from where I stood, and I knew I had to find a way to get my keys back or find an alternative escape before they realized I wasn't in the bathroom anymore. I crept around the exterior of the building, staying in the shadows and trying to see inside through the windows. I could see Darlene, the cook, and the manager all standing in the dining room now, looking toward the bathroom hallway and clearly discussing where I was. One of them started walking toward the hallway, probably to check if I was still in the bathroom. That's when I saw my car keys hanging on a hook behind the counter, along with several other sets of keys. The sight of multiple key sets confirmed my worst fears. These people had been targeting travelers for a while, collecting their vehicles and presumably doing something terrible to the drivers themselves. I still had the dispatcher on the phone, and she confirmed that deputies were en route, but were still about 15 minutes away. I explained about the keys behind the counter and asked if I should try to retrieve them or wait for police. She strongly advised me to stay, hidden and not confront the staff, but I knew that once they realized I'd escaped through the back door, they might dispose of evidence or flee before police arrived. What happened next was a combination of desperation and luck. I noticed that the diner's front door could be propped open from outside using a metal newspaper stand. If I could create a distraction that drew all 3 staff members toward the front or outside, I might be able to slip in through the back door, grab my keys from behind the counter, and get to my car before they realized what was happening. I found some rocks in the parking lot and threw them at the windows on the opposite side of the building from where my car was parked, creating loud banging sounds. I heard shouting from inside as the staff reacted to the noise, and I saw them moving toward the front of the building to investigate. I ran back to the loading dock door, entered through the storage room, and moved as quietly as possible through the employee area toward the dining room. I could hear them outside the front entrance, looking for whoever had thrown the rocks. I had maybe 30 seconds before they came back inside. I grabbed my keys from the hook behind the counter, along with my wallet, which I noticed had also been taken from the table, and ran back through the storage room to the loading dock. As I reached my car, I heard shouting from inside the diner. They'd realized I wasn't where they thought I was and had probably seen me through the windows. I started the car and peeled out of the parking lot just as the cook came running out the front door. I didn't look back, just drove as fast as I safely could down that dark Texas highway, shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel steady. About 10 minutes later, I passed 2 sheriff's vehicles heading in the opposite direction with lights flashing, presumably responding to the 911 call. I drove to the next town large enough to have a police station where I gave a detailed statement about what had happened. The deputies who'd responded to the scene reported finding the diner empty when they arrived, with no sign of the staff and no evidence in the back room I'd heard them mention. The building appeared to have been cleaned of any incriminating evidence, and all the vehicles in the parking lot were registered to people who'd been reported missing across multiple states over the past 2 years. The investigation revealed that the diner had been operating as a trap for vulnerable travelers, particularly those traveling alone late at night. The staff would drug food, steal keys, and hold victims in a concealed room while coordinating with human trafficking networks or harvesting identities and vehicles for resale. The discovery of multiple missing persons vehicles in the parking lot led to a massive multi-state investigation. The 3 people who'd been working at the diner that night were eventually identified and arrested in Oklahoma several months later, charged with kidnapping, human trafficking, and multiple counts of murder. Evidence found during their arrest confirmed they'd been operating similar schemes at different locations across the rural South, targeting long-distance travelers who wouldn't be immediately missed and whose disappearances would be difficult to trace. The experience completely changed how I approach long-distance driving. I never stop at isolated locations anymore, especially in the middle of the night. I always check reviews online before stopping at unfamiliar places, keep my keys on me at all times, and trust my instincts when something feels wrong about a situation. The few seconds it took to notice the empty diner, despite the full parking lot, to hear that conversation in the kitchen probably saved my life. The most disturbing aspect of the whole experience was how routine and organized their operation was. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was a calculated system for identifying, trapping, and exploiting vulnerable people, using the familiar American roadside diner as camouflage for something monstrous. They'd clearly done it many times before, perfecting their approach and getting away with it, because their victims were travelers passing through remote areas where disappearances might not be immediately connected.